of knowledge and effort of one or two or more people who work toward a definite purpose in the spirit of harmony.
And here at Inside the Mastermind, we focus on 5 main areas of life, which include mentally, physically, spiritually, financially, and socially. And we are here to help improve these areas in our own lives, as well as help you, the viewers, do the same and create a life of meaning, abundance, and greatness.
That's right. And today we are honored to have another Darrell with us here as our guest. And Greg, go ahead and get started with our questions for our honored guest. Darrell.
Hi, thanks for having me.
You're very welcome.
Thank you for coming.
All right, great. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. And then we're going to start with just the first question for you, Darrell, is can you tell us a little bit more about your background, specifically with psychological manipulation?
Okay, certainly. I have a military background, so I worked as an intelligence analyst, and throughout the course of my work there, I discovered that we had to figure out ways of identifying or verifying the information that whether or not the information we were getting was accurate, whether it was truthful. Some things that we would pick up, may have a decided spin to kind of lead us off the track. After I retired from the military, I worked as a government contractor in several other special programs. Some of them gave me some more insight into psychological operations, psychological warfare, strategic influencing, those types of things, all of those types of themes and messages that can either target and influence a populace or specific types of leaders. From there, I kind of transitioned over into cybersecurity, and I work now as a penetration tester / ethical hacker. And throughout the course of that work, I also have to use social engineering types of techniques, whether they be spear phishing or other types of spoofing attacks or something, to kind of target an individual and see if I can steer them in a desired direction. So that's kind of my the culmination of my background in terms of psychological manipulation across different types of media.
Thank you for sharing that, Darrell. And I guess my follow-up question, you talked a little bit about you kind of got into it in the military. Was there something that kind of jumped out at you, like, hey, I'd like to go ahead and move into this direction as far as psychological manipulation, or did they just say, hey, go do this? And how was it?
Well, yeah, it's interesting that you bring that up. As a matter of fact, Darrell, what kind of intrigued me is how governments or how individuals were able to kind of get into the mindset of a person, and through a systematic process of kind of feeding them different bits and pieces of information at specific times, they were either successful or unsuccessful in getting that person or that entity to act in a desired way. And that's what got me interested in digging a little bit deeper, and it started me thinking about if this is done on a large scale, it's most certainly done on a human interaction scale. And that's what kind of got me into digging a little bit deeper into how psychological manipulation can affect individuals just in everyday life.
Wow, that's amazing. I also want to say, first off, thank you for your service as well. You're welcome. And okay, so the next question I have for you is, because I never even heard this until Darrell brought this to my attention, but what is the, can you explain the concept of the drama triangle? What is that actually, and what is that all about?
Okay, well, the drama triangle deals with different types of manipulation, and it's on a social level. It's kind of like a social game. And if you're familiar with transactional analysis in psychology, it involves it's kind of like a quid pro quo. I'll do this for you if you do something in turn for me. And it's a series of games that go on, or these transactions that go on, and there's this expectation of being able to move towards some sort of expected or predetermined outcome. So what's interesting about that is within the drama triangle, we don't even realize it, but almost from birth, we're socially conditioned to think about like putting everybody else's needs ahead of ours, and we get conditioned to play these roles. So it's like boys don't cry, girls do this, or those sorts of things. So it's this ongoing conditioning process that leaves us susceptible to entering the game without us even knowing it.
Oh, that's pretty interesting. So as far as that goes, thank you for explaining the concept of the drama triangle. Who are usually the players within the drama triangle there?
Okay, well, there's usually there's three players involved, and they each have different sets of roles and different types of behaviors. So you've got the persecutor, you've got the rescuer, and then you have the victim. Now, with the persecutor, that individual's role or their types of behaviors, there's somebody that usually sets these types of extremely restrictive types of rules and limits. They tend to blame others for whatever happens, and they criticize the actions of everybody, and then they express this type of almost self-righteous anger and express these feelings that they're justified in doing so. They also use guilt and shaming techniques to put another person down. And the payoff for that is that the persecutor is the one that gets to be right, and therefore they're justified in all of the actions or their behaviors towards another individual. But with the rescuer, you've got an individual who feels kind of obligated to rescue somebody, and oftentimes they don't even really want to do it. But they constantly tend to do things for others that the individuals don't ask for. They offer help that isn't asked for, and these people could normally do for themselves. And the rescue tends to feel guilty, if they don't go out and help others. And a lot of times they kind of act and sound like this authoritative type of parent, and that's a means of trying to keep the victim dependent on them and kind of helpless in their rescuing. It's almost like they're going to be rescued whether they like it or not. And then finally, you've got the victim. And that's the individual who kind of feels like they're victimized, or they're oppressed, or they're even powerless for being in their situation. They tend to look to the rescuer to kind of perpetuate that individual's their own kind of negative feelings, and they use that victim role so that way they can avoid making decisions or solving problems and taking responsibility for their own action. That way, it's always going to be somebody else's fault. If there's a risk that the individual takes, it's always going to be somebody else's fault instead of them having to take responsibility for themselves. So those are kind of the three individuals and the roles in a nutshell, and it's a really interesting concept. One of the interesting pieces about this is that you would think out of the three roles, people tend to gravitate towards playing the part of the rescuer. But what happens on a subconscious level, people switch back and forth between these different roles, and often gravitate towards playing the role of the victim. You see, that way, as the victim, you can accuse somebody. As the victim, you can accuse somebody who isn't doing what you want, and kind of shame them, and frame them into that role of being a persecutor, which will kind of shame them and incentivize them to play the role of rescuer, and that way the victim gets what he or she wants.
Wow, that's.
I know this is like Greg's turn to ask a question, but this is pretty interesting. Like, I can see myself in a couple of those roles and other people around me in a couple of those roles. But go ahead, Greg. I'm sorry.
No, that's totally fine. Yeah, I think even it relates to even just like financial independence and how we're all conditioned and just taught to think one way. But it's just interesting, like these concepts and everything. So that's awesome. Thank you for that. So the next, I guess, the question I have for you is, who are the psyches? Hopefully I'm saying that right. And how are the psyches different from the players in the triangle?
Yeah, well, I think, I went back, I read up a little bit more on it, and psyche might not be the most accurate term. Psyche is kind of the culmination of human consciousness. I guess the better way to explain it might be the role or the persona more so than a psyche. So, with the persecutor, they have this tendency to play the authoritarian, the person that gives all of the orders. Everybody is supposed to answer to them. Then for the victim, they take on this persona kind of like of a child, a dependent, someone who's dependent on everyone else to do for them, and they kind of position themselves in situations to make sure that others have no choice but to do for them. And then you have the rescuer, who either willingly or unwillingly tends to play the role of the hero, the kind of like the knight in shining armor. And those are kind of the both the roles and the personas that these three types of people adopt.
Awesome. And I think you've explained it a little bit already, but so how is this game, this game usually played, would you say?
So part of it is the players use the games in a way that kind of gives them permission to express these difficult or sometimes taboo types of emotions. Things like anger, things like resentment, hostility, even these feelings of superiority over another individual. And by playing these games, that allows these people to feel justified in their behavior. It kind of gives them an excuse or justification for behaving in a way that's commonly viewed as socially unacceptable. And through indirect interpersonal relationships and communication, these people are able to project the unwanted parts of themselves or the negative parts of themselves onto others, and that justifies their behavior towards or the way that they treat others. So it's actually kind of like a projection type of game. It's the bad part of me that I recognize, but I'm going to project it onto somebody else, and that's going to give me justification for treating that individual in a negative manner.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay, well, I'm pretty sure some of our viewers may have the next question that I have as well, which is, how can you actually recognize if someone is using the drama triangle? What are some signs or cues of that?
Well, I think the easiest way to recognize it is when you start to develop this feeling that you're being forced to do something that you don't want to do, or you're starting to feel kind of resentful about a situation that you find yourself getting into. And one of the ways that one of the questions you can ask yourself is, are you the one that's starting to step into that role as the rescuer? Are you starting to do things for somebody that you don't really want to do? You're trying to meet the needs of other people without even having been asked to do that, or you're trying to fix other people's feelings. You're trying to help validate or explain to them how they should feel, or even if in some situations, are you just trying to step in and speak up for people, even though they are more than capable of speaking for themselves. So this is one way that you can recognize if you're being pulled into the game.
That kind of sounds like the average person in their 9-to-5 job being put in something they don't want to
do. pretty much, it happens to us all on a daily basis in different types of scenarios.
Yeah. So how would, and kind of cover this a little bit, how did one kind of break out of that drama triangle there?
Well, the best way to break out of it is you're gonna have to disengage, and disengaging from that individual often means that you're gonna have to take on the role of the persecutor. It may not necessarily be a voluntary role, but the role of the persecutor is your exit out. There are other players in the game. They're going to either feel hurt, they're going to be angry, or feel rejected because you're leaving the drama triangle, and you're not giving them that false sense of a relationship, or that false sense of intimacy through all of your dysfunctional social interaction that they've come to embrace and expect their kind of reward. So you kind of have to accept the fact that they're going to make you out as the bad guy, and you're going to have to learn to be okay with it. Now, a lot of times that sounds easier than it actually is, because one of the other games that that people play is this game called Coke Machine Syndrome. So if you're familiar with a Coke machine, you go up to a machine, you put in money, and you press a button and you expect a response. So what happens if you press that button and you don't get your Coke? Well, you'll tell them to press that button again. If you still don't get the response, you may push the button, only this time harder. And if you still get no response, you'll start pushing button after button to try and get some sort of a response, from the machine, until you finally get fed up and you walk off, kind of, cursing the machine under your breath, but you're going off in search of another Coke machine. So that's kind of the way that's one of the big games that you have to be aware of when you're trying to exit the drama triangle. Now, there's a couple of tools that you can use when somebody starts to try and play the blame game to try and draw you back into them. One of the things that you can do is you can just make a blanket statement. When somebody tries to accuse you of something, you can just say either, "Thank you, I'm aware of that," or you can tell them, "Thank you, I wasn't aware of that." And then you just leave it at that. You just acknowledge what they said, and you don't have to take any responsibility for their blame. The other thing that you can do in stopping the blame game is just ask these people out point blank, is there something that you want from me? And that kind of forces that player to ask directly what it is that they want out of that interaction, instead of having to go through the indirect transactions to make you try and guess and just kind of continue to manipulate you. And that way, by making them ask directly for what they want, that gives you the option of saying no. And then you can give your reasons for saying no, and then you just leave it at that. And that kind of neutralizes the blame game.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. Okay, so my next question, I guess, without going into too much detail, because probably this will be like a 3-hour podcast. Can you briefly tell us a little bit about other games or forms of psychological manipulation?
Sure. There's three. One's from a role of a persecutor, and it actually has a name. It's called Now I Got You, USOB. And as I said, it's a persecutor game where the objective or the payoff is for the persecutor to either get revenge on an individual or achieve domination over them. So the persecutor is going to look for any slight, just the slightest perceived transgression from somebody, and then just clamp down on it like a pit bull and just keep hammering away at that individual using whatever types of shaming techniques, belittling, or any other techniques to either extract some sort of an apology or humiliate the other person. And that becomes the persecutor's reward. Now, one of the games that's played by a rescuer is this one called I'm Only Trying to Help. And that kind of takes on that kind of plays to what the outcomes and the roles of the rescuer are anyway, where the individual is trying to do something for somebody that they could have easily done for themselves, or do even something that they didn't ask for. And this kind of tends to be this game of one-upsmanship. So it's designed to make the rescuer look like a kind and helpful person. And often in the mindset of the rescuer tends to view those people that he or she is helping as either weak or incapable of doing for themselves, and they need somebody who's quote unquote stronger or smarter than they are. And then from the victim standpoint, you've got a game that's called Poor Me, which I think all of us are pretty familiar with. It's that victim game, and it's supported by suffering. It's that common scenario, and it involves a failed rescue attempt. The victims feel bad in that failed attempt, and they get their payoff, through suffering, because nobody understands them or nobody cares about them. And that way that can transition into another game where it's kind of like the blame game, kind of like it's all your fault. So those are kind of three of the games. There's a ton more of them, and there's several books that I've been going over, and I can provide you guys with some of those titles too. They make for really interesting reads.
Well, maybe you should write a book on this stuff.
It's on my to-do list.
There you go, for sure. Well, Darrell, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us today. I do have kind of one more question, and then kind of I'll jump into another thing. well, probably a couple more questions, but one more question is just how can people get a hold of you and learn a little bit more about you there if they're looking to kind of learn more about Darrell?
Okay, well, there's a couple places. I've got an up and coming YouTube channel myself. It's called the Black Information Literacy Network, and it's designed, targeted primarily for the African American community, but it is open for everybody because these sorts of psychological manipulation games affect everyone. Where I'll be uploading content that speaks more into psychological manipulation. We'll dive into dissecting propaganda. We'll look into narrative warfare, as a matter of fact, too, which is a completely, an entirely different topic, as well as providing people with tools on identifying false logic and how to pick it out and allow them to think rationally and not get tricked or suckered into these emotionally charged types of interactions where you're more susceptible to being manipulated.
Very cool. And I would just say, as kind of a side note there, as we usually do in these episodes, if we'll go ahead and have Darrell's, and Darrell, this is the other question I meant to ask you. I was going to ask you again if you could pronounce your last name, because I was about to butcher it, and I was hoping you would just throw it out there, but you did it. So yeah.
Okay, sure. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, Darrell Lieteau. Yeah, my last name's pronounced Lieteau.
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 Okay. So
you say like light in Japanese, like Lieteau. That's how you say light in Japanese.
Okay.
Yeah, that's awesome.
he used to be in Japan for a little bit there, so yeah. Anyway, the third thing I wanted to share is that for anybody out there who's just kind of looking for self-improvement, definitely check out Gregg's site, which is planetgreenzen.com. Go ahead and check that out. But Darrell, we'll go ahead and get your information, your links out on this in the description here after this podcast as we kind of wrap up here, this YouTube, this live streaming there. But that's about it. Gregg, did you have anything else to add at the end here? Or?
I just want to thank you for your time, Darrell. I learned a lot just from this brief, moment that we had to digitally meet each other. So I learned a lot. It's like, wow, blew my mind, everything you were talking about. So thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you. It was my pleasure. I appreciate being invited out here. It was an honor and a privilege.
And we really appreciate your service, of course, as well, as Gregg already brought up. But thank you so much for joining us today. And with that, this is Inside the Mastermind. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day.
Bye, guys.
Bye.